They called it a violation notice. A piece of paper slipped into his mailbox, stamped with the official seal of the Homeowners Association. To most, it would have been nothing more than a formality, a reminder to repaint a fence, cut the grass, or trim a hedge. But to Marcus King, that paper represented something much deeper. It was the opening shot in a battle he hadn't asked for, but one he would not run away from. Marcus had lived on the land his family had owned for generations. His grandfather, a proud man who had once picked cotton in the deep South before migrating north, had saved every dollar he could to purchase that property. For the Kings, that land was not just soil, it was memory. It was blood. It was sacrifice. It was a declaration that no matter how much America tried to bend them, they would stand tall, rooted in earth that was theirs. So when Marcus opened the notice, he read it slowly, carefully. It accused him of unapproved modifications on his property. They said the barn he had repaired, the garden he had planted, and even the fencing around his land were non-compliant with community standards. The penalty was listed clearly: daily fines, escalating until the balance reached a staggering sum. Within weeks, the amount had ballooned: $10,000, $50,000, then an almost unbelievable $250,000. Marcus knew what this was. It wasn't about a barn. It wasn't about grass or fences or paint. It was about him, a black man living with pride, refusing to bow, holding on to land that others thought should not belong to someone like him. He could feel it in the way the letters were written, cold, patronizing, soaked with the kind of arrogance that had shadowed his people for centuries, neighbors whispered. Some shook their heads in sympathy, but others smirked behind curtains, convinced that Marcus would be forced to sell, forced to give up the home his family had fought for. They thought the HOA could bleed him dry, strip him of dignity, and remind him of his place. But what they didn't know was that Marcus was not the man they thought he was. Behind his calm smile was a mind sharpened by years of discipline. He was no stranger to contracts, deeds, and the quiet power of ownership. For Marcus was not just a homeowner in the neighborhood. He was, in fact, the majority stakeholder in the land on which the entire community stood. Long before the neighborhood sprouted its manicured lawns and identical houses, Marcus's family owned acres upon acres of that soil. When developers came knocking years ago, offering checks to carve up the land, the King family had struck a deal. They sold parcels. Yes, but they retained the mineral rights, easements, and a controlling interest in the land's association charter. It was written in legal ink, locked in documents most of the HOA board had never bothered to read. So when they sent Marcus that fine, when they arrogantly pushed him with threats and insults, they didn't realize they were picking a fight with the very man who held the ground beneath their feet. Still, Marcus didn't rush. He didn't storm into the HOA meeting shouting or waving papers. He let them build their case, let them stack their arrogance higher and higher. He attended meetings quietly, listening as they mocked him, some even implying that certain people should be grateful to live in such a neighborhood. His presence unsettled them. His silence unnerved them. And all the while, the fines piled higher. Then came the breaking point. The HOA sent a final demand letter, declaring that if Marcus didn't pay the $250,000, they would seize his property and auction it. The words were heavy with threat, soaked in superiority. That was when Marcus knew it was time to speak. On a warm evening, the HOA gathered in their meeting hall, a glass-walled room meant to showcase order and authority. Marcus walked in with a leather folder under his arm. He sat patiently as they began their usual routine, listing violations, passing judgments, playing the part of rulers over a small patch of suburbia. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood slowly, unfolded the folder, and laid several documents on the table. "I received your notice," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I've read your fines. But before you go any further, I think you should read this." He slid the first paper across the table. It was the original land deed, dated decades earlier, with his grandfather's name written in neat ink. Then came the mineral rights agreement, then the easement contracts, and finally the association charter with his signature as majority landholder. The room grew quiet. The board members leaned forward, confusion rippling across their faces. Marcus let the silence hang heavy before continuing. "You fined me for building on land that belongs to my family. You threatened to take it from me. But what you didn't know is that you're sitting in a hall built on my property. Your homes rest on my soil. Your authority, your very existence as an HOA, depends on the agreements my family signed." Some shifted in their seats, eyes darting to one another, One man coughed nervously, another whispered, "Is this real?" Marcus simply nodded. "I could today revoke your easements. I could dissolve this association. Every letter you've sent me is not just insulting, it's void. And every dollar you've fined me, you owe back with interest." The weight of his words fell like thunder. The board members who had smirked and mocked now sat pale, their arrogance melting into panic. For the first time, they saw Marcus not as the man they could bully, but as the man who held power far beyond their reach. But Marcus wasn't there to humiliate. He wasn't there to seek vengeance. He was there for dignity, for justice. He leaned forward, his eyes steady. "You thought you could break me. You thought you could strip away what my family built. But I am not just a resident here. I am the foundation on which this community stands. I don't want your apologies. I don't want your excuses. What I want is respect, not just for me, but for every person you think you can intimidate, every voice you try to silence. That ends today." The silence was deafening. The board knew they had no ground to stand on. Marcus gathered his papers, tucked them back into his folder, and walked toward the door. But before leaving, he turned back one last time. "This land remembers who it belongs to, and so do I." And with that, he stepped into the night, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces. What Marcus had done was more than a defense of property. It was a reclaiming of dignity, a reminder that power is not always where it seems to be. His story would ripple through the neighborhood, through the town, a whisper of resistance that could not be ignored. Yet this was only the beginning. The fight was not over. The HOA had awakened something far greater than they had bargained for. Marcus knew the days ahead would test him, would challenge his patience and his pride. But he also knew this. No fine, no threat, no board of signatures could erase the truth of ownership, the truth of history, the truth of his family's unshakable place in that land. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Some offered quiet nods of respect. Others whispered rumors about what had happened in the meeting. Word spread quickly how the man, they thought was just another homeowner, had revealed himself as the very foundation of the community they lived in. But the HOA wasn't done. Pride is a stubborn beast, and arrogance rarely admits defeat so easily. Within a week, Marcus received another letter. This time it was carefully worded, stripped of the open hostility of the earlier notices. Instead, it invited him to a special session to clarify misunderstandings and seek resolution. Marcus smiled when he read it. He had expected this. Power, once threatened, always tried to claw back. But he also knew that his strength was not in anger, not in retaliation. His strength was in the patience his grandfather had taught him, the discipline to let truth speak louder than fury. On the evening of the session, the board sat stiffly in their chairs, their faces tight with unease. Marcus walked in carrying not only his folder, but also something else, a framed photograph of his grandfather, a man with weathered hands and proud eyes. He placed it on the table before speaking. "My grandfather bought this land when people said, 'A black man could never own property here,'" Marcus began. He worked fields from sunrise to dusk, not just for survival, but for a dream, that his children and grandchildren would stand on ground that belonged to them. You tried to take that from me with fines, threats, and arrogance. But what you don't understand is that this land is not just mine. It is legacy. It is struggle. It is victory." The board sat in silence. A few lowered their eyes. But Marcus was not finished. "You owe me $250,000 in false fines. You owe my family decades of respect you never thought we deserved. But I'm not here to collect your money. I'm here to remind you of something greater. This community will not be built on exclusion. Not on intimidation, not on the belief that one group has the right to dictate over another. If you want this neighborhood to thrive, it must be on the foundation of fairness." He let the words sink in. Then, with deliberate calm, he handed out copies of a new document, an amendment to the association's charter. It stripped the HOA board of the power to issue fines, without unanimous consent of its members. It established a fairness committee to represent all residents equally. And at the very bottom, it included a clause affirming that the community existed only with, Marcus's continued, consent as majority landholder. The message was clear. The rules had changed. Some protested. They muttered about precedent, about overreach. But they knew the truth. They had no legal standing to defy him. If they pushed harder, Marcus could dissolve the HOA entirely, leaving them scrambling in chaos. They were trapped by the very soil beneath their feet. One board member, An older woman who had once silently voted against the harshest measures finally spoke. "Mr. King, what do you want from us?" Marcus paused. He looked around the room, at the faces that had mocked him only weeks before. And then he spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. "I want my children to walk through this neighborhood and never feel less than anyone else. I want no one, black, white, rich, poor, to be told they don't belong. I want respect, not just for me, but for every family who calls this place home. That is what I want." The words carried weight. For the first time, some of the board members saw Marcus not as a man to be pushed aside, but as a leader who demanded fairness. And though their egos burned, they knew they had no choice but to accept. The amendment passed. The fines were rescinded, and slowly, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. People who had once watched Marcus from a distance now approached him with quiet gratitude. Some told him stories of how they, too, had felt silenced by the board, though for different reasons. Others admitted they had judged him unfairly, blinded by stereotypes and assumptions. Marcus accepted their words, but he never forgot. Forgiveness, he believed, was not forgetting. It was remembering with strength, and choosing to walk forward without letting bitterness poison the soil. Weeks turned into months, and the story of what had happened spread beyond the neighborhood. Local papers caught wind of the tale. The black man fined nearly $250,000 million by an HOA, only to reveal he owned the very land beneath their homes. It became a symbol, a story of resilience that echoed far beyond property lines. In church halls and barbershops, in community meetings, Marcus's name was spoken with pride. Parents told their children about him, not as a hero of war or politics, but as a man who defended dignity with wisdom and patience. He became a reminder that power is not always loud, not always in uniforms or titles. It is sometimes quiet, steady, and rooted in generations of sacrifice. And through it all, Marcus kept returning to the land. On evenings when the sun sank low, he would stand by the barn, looking out at the soil his grandfather once tilled. He thought of the battles his family had endured, chains, fields, segregation, laws designed to break them, and how each generation had carried the weight forward until it was his turn. Now the land stood as both a monument and a promise. One night, as he watched his young son chase fireflies across the grass, Marcus knelt beside him. "Do you know why this land matters?" he asked softly. The boy shook his head. Marcus pointed to the soil. "Because this land remembers. It remembers the struggle, the sweat, the prayers. It remembers the hands that worked it, the dreams that shaped it. And it remembers that no one can take from us what we refuse to surrender." The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, and Marcus smiled. "One day it'll be yours to protect, and when that day comes, you'll stand firm just as I did." In that moment, Marcus understood the full circle of his fight. The $250,000 fine, the arrogance of the HOA, the silence of the neighbors. It had all been part of a test. And he had passed, not by shouting louder, but by standing stronger. The story of Marcus King was no longer just his own. It was a story for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every family who had fought to hold on to their piece of dignity in a world eager to strip it away. It was a reminder that ownership is more than property. It is identity, legacy, and truth. And so the neighborhood continued, its streets quiet, its homes standing neat in rows. But beneath the surface, the soil carried a new story, one that whispered through the roots of every tree, every blade of grass. That respect cannot be fined. That dignity cannot be seized. That justice, though patient, always finds its voice. And that voice belonged, and always would belong, to Marcus King. Seasons changed, and the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The HOA that once strutted with unchecked authority now moved cautiously, aware that their power had been reshaped forever. And though Marcus had returned to the quiet routines of his life, working his land, tending his garden, walking his son to school, his presence carried a new weight. People no longer looked through him. They looked to him. But Marcus never sought fame. His victories weren't measured in headlines or whispers of admiration. They were measured in the small moments, the neighbor who, once cold and distant, now stopped to share a kind word. The young black family that moved into the community and felt welcome, because someone had already paved the way. The elderly couple who thanked him for challenging the board, because they too had suffered under needless fines and threats. For Marcus, these were not victories of pride, but of purpose. His grandfather had taught him that ownership was not just about holding papers and deeds. It was about shaping a place where others could stand. taller because you had endured. Still, the scars of the battle lingered. Not everyone had changed. Some neighbors carried resentment in their eyes, quiet but sharp. They whispered that Marcus had embarrassed the community, that he had played the race card, that he had humiliated good people who were only doing their jobs. Marcus heard these whispers and they stung. But he also knew that dignity was not about pleasing everyone. It was about standing firm in truth, even when truth made others uncomfortable. One evening, the HOA attempted a small act of defiance. They sent out a new set of suggestions, dressed up as friendly reminders, requests about how residents should landscape, how long holiday decorations should remain up, how noise should be controlled. At first glance, they seemed harmless. But Marcus saw the familiar language between the lines, attempts to reassert control. This time, Marcus didn't respond with documents or meetings. Instead, he hosted a gathering at his property, a cookout open to every neighbor. Children ran through the yard, music floated in the air, and laughter replaced the stiffness that had long defined the neighborhood. Standing before the crowd, Marcus spoke not as a landholder, not as a man wielding legal power, but as a neighbor. "This community doesn't need more rules," he said. "It needs more respect. We don't need more fines. We need more friendship. The soil we live on doesn't care about fences or decorations. It cares about the roots we plant in each other's lives. That's what I want us to remember." The words struck deeper than any legal document could. People listened, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. In that moment, Marcus transformed from defender of his legacy to leader of his community. The neighborhood moved on, but it would never forget. Every home stood now on more than concrete foundations. They stood on a story of resistance, of truth, of a man who refused to be fined out of his dignity, a story that would echo long after Marcus himself was gone. For in the end, his legacy was not just the land. It was the unshakable reminder that no matter how high the fine, how heavy the threat, or how arrogant the authority, dignity belongs to those who refuse to surrender it. And so the land remembered, and so did the people, and so would history. Years passed, but the story of Marcus King never faded. It was retold in classrooms, shared in sermons, and whispered in family gatherings where elders spoke of land, pride, and perseverance. The tale had grown into more than just a neighborhood dispute. It had become a symbol of what it meant to stand firm against quiet injustice. Marcus himself remained a humble figure. He still walked his property at dawn, greeting the day with the same calm, discipline that had carried him through the fight. He still tended his garden, repaired his fences, and built with his own hands. But his life had expanded in ways he never expected. One evening, he was invited to speak at a nearby university. The auditorium was packed. Students, professors, activists, and community leaders all gathered to hear. The man who had faced down an HOA and revealed a legacy of ownership. Few could imagine. Marcus stood at the podium, his voice steady, his story unfolding not as a speech but as a lesson. "They thought they could fine me into submission," he told the audience. "But I wasn't just protecting property. I was protecting history. I was protecting the sacrifices of those who came before me. That is why I could not bend. Because every time we surrender our dignity, we dishonor the blood, the sweat, the prayers of those who carried us this far." The crowd rose to their feet, not in applause for Marcus alone, but for the truth he carried. Many left that night determined to dig into their own family histories, to uncover deeds and titles, to reclaim stories that had been hidden or forgotten. Marcus's story had become a spark, igniting fires far beyond his small neighborhood. But not all attention was celebratory. National news outlets picked up the narrative, and with fame came scrutiny. Commentators debated whether Marcus had been too harsh on the HOA, whether he had embarrassed good people. Some accused him of exaggeration, of turning a simple property dispute into a racial matter. Marcus did not respond with anger. He understood something deeper. Whenever truth disrupts comfort, those who benefit from the old order will always try to twist the story. Instead of defending himself on television or social media, Marcus kept building. He started a foundation dedicated to helping Black families research land ownership, reclaim deeds, and fight unfair property practices. The foundation grew rapidly, supported not just by activists, but by everyday families who wanted to ensure their children would inherit not just houses, but histories. Through the foundation, Marcus met people whose stories mirrored his own. Families fined into foreclosure, elders stripped of property through technicalities, heirs who had lost land to development schemes. Each story was a wound, but together they formed a movement. Land is more than dirt, Marcus told them at one gathering. It is memory. It is power. And when we reclaim our land, we reclaim our place in history. His words carried weight because they were not abstract. They were lived. He had stood where they stood, felt the sting of papers designed to break him, heard the whispers of neighbors who doubted him, and he had prevailed. Back in his neighborhood, Marcus's role had shifted from defender to elder. Children grew up hearing the story of the man who owned the soil beneath their homes. Teenagers who once sped down the streets on bikes now came to him for advice. Before leaving for college, he never preached, never demanded respect. He simply listened, and when he spoke, his words carried the gravity of a man who had endured storms without bowing. His son, now older, often walked the land with him. Together they studied the soil, the trees, the markers of history etched into the very earth. Marcus taught him the lessons his grandfather had once whispered. "This land doesn't just belong to us," he told his son. "We belong to it. And when you carry it forward, you carry every story written in its roots." The boy nodded, his young eyes reflecting both the pride and the weight of that responsibility. Marcus knew the fight was not over. It never would be. But he also knew the future was ready. One summer afternoon, Marcus hosted a reunion on the property. Dozens of relatives gathered, some traveling across states to stand on the soil their grandfather had bought decades ago. They cooked, sang, prayed, and laughed under the wide sky. At sunset, Marcus gathered them all and pointed toward the barn. The very structure the HOA had once claimed was a violation. "This barn was their excuse to fine me," he said softly. "But look at it now. It stands not as a violation, but as a monument. They wanted to use it to break us. Instead, it became the reason we rose." Tears welled in many eyes. For the family, the barn was no longer just wood and nails. It was resilience made visible. As night fell, Marcus looked out over the gathering, his family, his neighbors, his community. The fireflies danced in the fields, just as they had years earlier when his son chased them with laughter in his voice. And Marcus understood something deeper than ever before. The HOA had thought they were fining one man, but in truth they had awakened a story that belonged to many. A story older than their rules, older than their meetings, older even than their community. It was the story of a people who had endured every attempt to strip them of land, dignity, and future, and still stood. Marcus breathed deeply, the night air heavy with history and hope. His fight had begun with a fine, but it had ended as a legacy, one that stretched beyond his neighborhood, beyond his family, into the hearts of strangers who now carried their own battles with new strength. The land had remembered. He had remembered. And now the world would not forget. The years moved steadily forward, and with them Marcus's son grew taller, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening. The boy who once chased fireflies across the fields was now a young man on the cusp of adulthood, and though his laughter remained, so too had a seriousness begun to take root in him, a recognition that his life carried more than youthful dreams. It carried inheritance. Marcus watched with quiet pride. He had never forced his son into the weight of legacy, never demanded that he become a reflection of his father. Instead, he gave him freedom, the same freedom his grandfather had once prayed for. But legacy has a way of calling on its own, and Marcus saw the signs in the way his son lingered on the land, asking questions about the soil, the trees, the deeds. One evening, they walked together near the barn. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the ground. Marcus's son paused, his hands tucked in his pockets. "Dad," he began, his voice steady but thoughtful, "when they tried to fine you, did you ever feel afraid?" Marcus stopped. He looked at his son, seeing not just the boy he had raised, but the man he was becoming. Slowly he nodded. Yes, fear was there. Fear of losing what my grandfather built. Fear of being humiliated. Fear of standing alone. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to keep standing anyway. The young man nodded, his brow furrowed. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have done what you did." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "You won't fight the same battles I did. You'll fight your own, but you'll carry the same strength. That's what matters." Those words settled in his son's heart, though Marcus could see the weight they carried. Months later, the neighborhood faced another test. The HOA, now under new leadership, had tried to reinvent itself, but some old habits lingered. A new family had moved in, young and black, their children full of energy. Within weeks, the HOA sent them a letter, citing noise disturbances because their kids played basketball in the driveway. It was the same subtle weapon, dressed in new language. Marcus had grown older by then, his hair streaked with gray. He watched the situation carefully, but this time he did not step forward first. Instead, he waited. And to his quiet satisfaction, his son rose. The young man attended the HOA meeting, not with the weight of his father's authority, but with the clarity of his own voice. He reminded the board of the changes made years before, the promises of fairness. He spoke not with anger, but with conviction, echoing the calm strength he had learned at his father's side. "These kids aren't a disturbance," he said firmly. "They're a reminder of what community should look like: laughter, energy, growth. If this neighborhood can't make room for children being children, then it isn't a neighborhood worth living in." The board members listened, some nodding reluctantly, others shuffling uncomfortably. But the truth was undeniable. The fine was rescinded, and for the first time, Marcus saw his son not as a boy learning, but as a man leading. Later that night, as they sat on the porch, Marcus turned to him. "You spoke with courage," he said quietly. His son shook his head. "I only did what you would have done." "No," Marcus replied with a small smile. "You did what you were meant to do. And that's even greater." The neighborhood began to see the son as they had once seen the father, a figure of quiet strength, a reminder that dignity, once defended, cannot be easily erased. Children gravitated toward him, parents trusted him, elders respected him. The torch had passed, not with ceremony, but with the natural flow of life. And Marcus, watching from the edges, felt a peace settle in his spirit. He had carried the weight through storms. Now his son carried the flame into new days. As the seasons turned, the land itself seemed to bear witness. The trees grew taller, their roots deeper, as if echoing the generations that now walk their shade. The barn stood proudly, no longer a point of contention, but a landmark of resilience. And the soil, rich and dark, continued to remind those who touched it that history does not vanish, it endures. On his final walk across the fields one evening, Marcus paused. His body was slower now, but his spirit felt light. His son walked beside him, steady and sure. Together they stopped at the edge of the property, looking out over the neighborhood that had once tried to break them. "Do you feel it?" Marcus asked softly. His son nodded. "Yes, the land remembers." Marcus smiled, the same smile his grandfather once carried. "And now so will you." The torch was no longer in Marcus's hands. It had been placed quietly but firmly into the hands of the next generation. And with that, the story of resistance, dignity, and justice lived on, no longer a single man's fight, but a family's unbroken legacy. For every step his son took, every stand he made, every voice he lifted in defense of what was right, the world would remember not just Marcus King, but the unending truth his life had proved. That fines can be erased, but dignity cannot. That power can shift, but legacy endures. And that when one generation stands firm, the next learns how to rise taller. And so the story continued, written not just in ink or memory, but in footsteps across the soil of a land that remembered. Time is the truest storyteller. Decades slipped quietly into history, and the world that Marcus once knew began to change. The streets of his neighborhood aged, new families arrived, and children who once played in the driveways grew into parents themselves. Yet through all the seasons, one thing remained unbroken: the story of Marcus King and the soil that remembered. Marcus's son had carried the torch faithfully, guiding the community with the steady hand of one who had learned from struggle. But now another figure was rising, Marcus's grandson, a boy born years after the battle with the HOA, yet shaped by its echoes. His name was Elijah. From the time he could walk, Elijah followed his father and grandfather across the land. He listened to their stories not as tales from the past, but as living truths that spoke directly to him. To Elijah, the barn was not old wood but a monument. The soil beneath his feet was not dirt but memory. And the photographs of his great-grandfather, worn and faded, were not relics but reminders. By the time Elijah reached adulthood, the world outside had grown louder, faster, and more complicated. Technology reshaped neighborhoods. Corporations swallowed land, and communities struggled to keep their histories intact. Many families lost their roots to development projects, to gentrification, to the endless march of progress that cared little for memory. But Elijah carried something the world could not erase, an inheritance of defiance and dignity. One summer, a corporation approached the neighborhood. They offered to buy large sections of land, to build commercial centers and luxury condos. Their proposal was wrapped in promises, jobs, growth, prestige. Some neighbors were tempted, dazzled by numbers that seemed impossible to refuse. But Elijah felt the unease beneath the glittering words. He remembered his grandfather's lesson. Every time we surrender our dignity, we dishonor the blood, the sweat, the prayers of those who carried us this far. At a town meeting, the representatives of the corporation spoke confidently, believing money would sway hearts. When Elijah stood, the room quieted. His presence carried the same gravity Marcus once held, a strength that didn't shout but resonated. My grandfather once faced an HOA that thought land was just paper, Elijah began. He showed them it was legacy. Now you stand here thinking money will buy what sacrifice built, but you can't put a price on memory. You can't buy dignity, and you will not take what my family bled to protect. His words echoed, firm and resolute. Some neighbors clapped, others wiped tears from their eyes. The corporation tried to argue, tried to sweeten the deal, but the community had heard the truth. And once truth is spoken with clarity, it cannot be drowned by noise. The proposal failed. The land remained untouched. And Elijah, like his father and grandfather before him, became a protector of memory. Years later, Elijah stood with his own children, telling them the story of Marcus King. He spoke of the $250,000 fine that had been meant to strip them of dignity, but instead ignited a legacy. He told them of the barn, the meetings, the cookouts, the victories. And as he spoke, he saw in their young eyes the same spark that once burned in his own. The story had become more than a family tale. It had become scripture, an inheritance passed from tongue to ear, from heart to heart. Each generation carried it not as a burden but as armor. As Elijah's daughter once asked him, "Why do we tell this story so much?" He smiled, kneeling beside her. "Because the world forgets too easily. And when the world forgets, it tries again. Our story is how we remind it that we will not bend." The land itself bore witness. The barn still stood, restored now into a community center where children played and elders gathered. The soil still carried the roots of trees planted by Marcus himself. And each summer, the family reunion brought together faces old and new, all bound by the unshakable truth that dignity, once defended, becomes eternal. One evening, as Elijah's children chased each other across the fields, he stood silently, the wind brushing against him. In that quiet moment he felt it, a presence not seen but deeply known. His father's steady hand, his grandfather's unbreakable resolve, his great-grandfather's hope written in sweat and sacrifice. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We remember." And the land seemed to whisper back. Generations would come and go. The houses in the neighborhood would change. Technology, politics, economies, everything would shift with time. But the story of Marcus King, the man who stood against a $250,000 fine and revealed the strength of legacy, would never fade. It would live in the soil. It would live in the barn. It would live in the children who carried the name, and in the neighbors who carried the memory. For some stories are not meant to end. They are meant to echo, through roots, through time, through the hearts of those who refuse to surrender. And so, decades after Marcus's first stand, his family still walked the land with heads high. His grandson, his great-grandchildren, and all who came after carried the same truth forward. That no authority, no paper, no fine could strip away what was earned through blood and endurance. That dignity cannot be seized. That legacy cannot be erased. And as the sun set over the fields one quiet evening, Elijah's daughter, barely old enough to write her name, looked up and said, "Daddy, one day will I tell the story too?" Elijah smiled, lifting her into his arms. "Yes, and when you tell it, you'll remind the world that we belong here. Always." The story was safe. The torch was passed. The land remembered, and so would they. Time has a way of stretching stories beyond the people who first lived them. What begins as a family's battle can, with patience and truth, become something far larger, a lesson written into the fabric of a nation. So it was with Marcus King. Decades after his first stand against the HOA, his descendants still carried the flame. But the world had begun to see his story not just as theirs, but as history itself. Local schools invited Elijah and his children to speak about the land. College professors taught classes where Marcus's fight was dissected not as a simple dispute, but as an emblem of resistance against systemic injustice. Documentaries were filmed, voices of neighbors recorded, the barn itself preserved as a historic site. It was strange at first for Elijah to walk into a bookstore and see his grandfather's name printed on the spine of history texts, or to hear strangers quoting Marcus's words about dignity and legacy. Yet deep down, he knew this was always the destination. Stories rooted in truth do not stay hidden. They push their way into the light, refusing to be buried. One summer, the family gathered once more for their reunion. Generations filled the fields with laughter, grills smoked. Children chased one another between the trees. But this time, the reunion carried a new energy. The governor had declared the land an official heritage site, protected in honor of Marcus King and the battle that preserved it. The ceremony was simple but powerful. Elders sat in chairs near the barn, their hands trembling but their eyes burning with pride. Children waved flags bearing the family crest, a tree rooted deep, its branches stretching outward. And at the center stood Elijah, holding a plaque that would be mounted on the barn's wall. It read, "On this land Marcus King stood against injustice. He taught us that fines may threaten, power may press, but dignity endures. This soil remembers, and so will we." As the words were unveiled, the crowd erupted in cheers. Tears streamed down faces. For a moment, Elijah closed his eyes, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice whispering through the wind. "We belong here, always. But legacy is not meant to be static. It does not survive in plaques alone. It must breathe, move, and inspire." And so, the family transformed the barn into more than a monument. It became a living space of education, a community center where young people came to learn not only history, but also the skills to defend themselves in the future: law, economics, leadership, storytelling. Children who had never known Marcus still grew up hearing his name, tracing their fingers along the grooves of the plaque, asking their parents, "What did he do?" And each time the answer would rise again like a hymn. He stood. He did not bend. The ripple spread further. Across the country, Black families facing similar struggles found strength in Marcus's story. His name was invoked in courtrooms, his example cited in debates about housing rights and racial justice. Neighborhoods that once felt powerless began to push back against unfair treatment, armed with the knowledge that dignity, when defended, could shift the balance of power. In time, even the descendants of those who once served on the HOA board came forward. Some confessed the shame they carried for how their families had treated Marcus. Others offered public apologies, joining in the preservation of the land as a sign of reconciliation. And though pain could never be erased, healing found room to grow. Elijah's children, now grown, watched all this with awe. They realized that their family's story was no longer just theirs. It had become a banner for others, a proof that struggle and triumph could echo far beyond one man's lifetime. On the anniversary of Marcus's passing, the family gathered in silence at the barn. Elijah, now older with silver streaking his beard, stood with his children and grandchildren. He spoke softly, almost as though speaking to Marcus himself. "You started this with courage. You taught us to hold the land, to honor the soil, to protect our dignity. Today the world knows your name. And tomorrow, long after we are gone, they will still tell your story." A breeze swept across the fields, rustling the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of earth and memory. Some swore they felt it, the presence of Marcus himself, standing proud, unbroken, smiling as his legacy stretched across the generations. And so the story of Marcus King, once confined to a battle over a $250,000 fine, had transformed into something immortal. It was no longer about an HOA or even a neighborhood. It was about dignity written into history, about a people refusing to be erased, about a family that proves strength is not measured by wealth or titles, but by the courage to stand. When standing seems impossible, the land remained, the family remained, and the story remained, not as a relic of the past, but as a living promise for the future. Because some legacies do not fade. They grow, they endure, they become eternal. And Marcus King's name, once spoken only within the walls of his home, now lived on the lips of strangers, carried across classrooms, whispered in prayers, shouted in protests, and etched forever into the memory of a people who would never again be told they did not belong. For the land remembered, the family remembered, and so did the world. 100 years had passed since Marcus King first stood against the HOA that tried to strip him of dignity. 100 years since the fine that was meant to break him instead became the spark that ignited a legacy. Time had moved forward, generations had come and gone, yet the name Marcus King had not faded. It had grown. The neighborhood he once fought to protect was no longer just a cluster of homes. It had become a landmark, a destination for students, historians, and families who wished to walk the soil of resilience. The barn, carefully preserved, stood not only as a community center but as a museum. Inside its walls hung photographs, documents, and recordings, telling the story of how one black man refused to bend, and how that refusal rippled into eternity. Every year, thousands gathered on what was now called Marcus King Day, a holiday recognized not only in the state but across the country. Children paraded with banners of trees whose roots dug deep into the earth, a symbol of legacy. Scholars delivered lectures on housing justice, using Marcus's case as a turning point in law. Musicians performed songs inspired by his courage. And families of every background came together to remember that strength is not measured by wealth, but by the will to stand tall. When the world demands you kneel. In classrooms, children read Marcus's words as if they were scripture. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to keep standing anyway. Teachers spoke of him not as a distant historical figure, but as an ancestor of justice, a man whose defiance carved a path forward for countless others. His descendants still carried the flame, though they no longer bore the burden alone. The world had taken the story into its own heart. Elijah's grandchildren and great-grandchildren attended ceremonies, spoke at universities, and traveled the world to share what their forefather had done. But in truth, the legacy was no longer just theirs, and it belonged to everyone. Whoever felt the sting of injustice, everyone who needed a reminder that dignity, once defended, becomes eternal. One crisp autumn evening, on the centennial of Marcus's stand, a gathering took place at the land. The barn glowed with soft light, and people filled the fields as far as the eye could see. Elders in wheelchairs, children on their parents' shoulders, activists, artists, politicians, teachers, all stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting. At the center, a bronze statue of Marcus was unveiled. It depicted him standing tall, his hand resting on the deed to his land, his gaze lifted toward the horizon. The sculptor had captured not just his likeness, but his spirit, unbroken, unwavering, rooted. As the veil dropped and the crowd erupted in applause, Elijah's great-granddaughter stepped forward. Her voice carried across the silence that followed. My great-grandfather Marcus was not a king by title. He was a king because he refused to be moved. He fought not for glory, but for dignity, and his fight belongs to all of us now. When you walk this land, remember not just what he did, but what you must do. Stand, protect, refuse to bend. The crowd erupted again, some with tears, some with fists raised in solidarity. And in that moment, it became clear, Marcus King was no longer just a man who lived and died. He was a symbol, a legend, a reminder woven into the fabric of Black history, and American history, and that power is not absolute, and dignity cannot be priced. Far beyond the neighborhood, his name echoed. Streets were renamed after him. Schools bore his legacy. Activists carried his story to international stages, reminding the world that justice must be fought for in every generation. His life had become more than history. It had become prophecy, a guide for those yet unborn. And yet, for all the grandeur, the truest remembrance still lived in the soil. On quiet days, when the crowds were gone and the land rested under the sun, families still came to walk the fields, to place their hands on the earth, to whisper words of gratitude. For they knew what Marcus had known, that land remembers, that soil holds memory, that every blade of grass carried the echo of his footsteps, every root the strength of his resolve. A century later, Marcus's story had become legend, but it had not drifted into myth. It remained grounded, real, unshakable, because legend, when rooted in truth, does not vanish into fantasy, it becomes eternal. As the sun set on that centennial day, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Elijah's great-granddaughter stood at the edge of the field, with her own child by her side. The little one looked up at the bronze statue and asked softly, "Mama, was he really that strong?" She smiled, kneeling so her eyes met his. "Yes, but do you know what made him strong?" The child shook his head. "He never forgot who he was, and neither will we." The boy nodded, his small hand tightening around hers. Together they stood in silence, the bronze figure towering above them, the land stretching out beneath their feet. And in the hush of that moment, as the wind rustled the trees, it was as if the land itself spoke once more. We remember, always, and so the story of Marcus King did not end. It did not fade. It lived, in soil, in memory, in hearts, in generations yet unborn. For dignity defended once becomes a light that no passage of time can extinguish, and Marcus King's light would burn forever.